Chapter 1, Part 2. It was not an ordinary unearthly, but the highest among this powerful nature, a vampire, which was clear from his crystal violet eyes, pale twinkling in the night darkness. He was very tall and gorgeously built. Even the rich black robe that hung from his shoulders to the floor could not hide it. Undoubtedly, he was also very handsome, although there was nothing soft or puny about his beauty. His facial features were sharp, even a little rough. The cheekbones were pointed, as if from a long fast. His ears were bent down, and his hair was thick and dark, like the night around, even darker. It covered most of his forehead, making his eyes doubly brighter and scarier. Jack, of course, did not care about his beauty at all. He could not remember himself from horror, and it was quite understandable. The Dark Ones had never appeared in Silver Cauldron. In his entire life he had not seen even a single of them. As for vampires, there was no point even thinking about them. People did not even dare to dream of meeting these legendary creatures. Many had never seen even a single of them, especially in a backwoods county like Silver Cauldron. Jack's confusion and fear were quite understandable. The vampire stopped about half-a-meter in front of him, saying nothing and taking no action. What scared Jack the most about him was the expression of his face. It was somehow strange, sinister. His mouth was compressed into a thin line, and all the muscles of his face seemed terribly tense, stony, as if he was suppressing something in himself or fighting with something that was an absolute mystery for Jack. Moreover, he looked so intently and steadily, with such a frightening, insane greed, that it would have horrified anyone, not just a 12-year-old boy. His whole figure was putting Jack down, causing a slight nausea and dizziness. He would like to escape, but could not move a single muscle. The unearthly seemed to him a formidable giant, while he himself felt like a useless, miserable bug. The air around him seemed to thicken and squeeze his head, as if in a bear's grip, so that it seemed like it would explode at any time. The moment when the unearthly stretched out his hand to him, Jack caught only with the edge of his consciousness. The pressure eventually surpassed his physical and mental strength, and he collapsed senseless. When Jack regained consciousness, his comrades were crowding around him, and Herbert was pouring cherry juice from liver fur into his mouth. From the direction of the main square came the familiar festive noise, and there were as many people in the alleyway as there were ears of corn in a sheaf. "What happened to you?" everyone shouted in unison after seeing that Jack had opened his eyes. I fell down and hit my head." "You need to be more careful." Herbert seemed gloomy, but it was because of the fear he had experienced for his brother. "And you, where have you been for so long?" "What do you mean?" Doug asked in surprise. "We were running right behind you. We turned exactly where you turned and found you already lying on the ground." What would Jack do? He was smart enough to know that no one would believe his story. Besides, he did not want to tell anything. Firstly, everyone would laugh at him for sure, and secondly, he himself did not really understand completely what had happened to him at all. Only the next day he could not stand it and told Herbert about everything. His brother initially thought that it was a tricky joke, but when he saw the unfeigned fear and anxiety in Jack's eyes, he believed him. However, even together they could not find an explanation for what happened. It became their common, unfathomable secret, which they both were sure would remain like this forever. 10 years later. Even during her husband's lifetime, Selina Estancia was a rather grumpy and greedy woman, who many people in Silver Cauldron disliked. But after becoming a widow, she completely lost any positive traits of her character, which from the very beginning were not too many. In her youth, Selina was extraordinarily beautiful, and throughout her life she carried the conviction of her exclusivity and the injustice of her lot. It is worth noting that this fate was not so terrible. She got a kind and hard-working man for her husband, Herbert and Jack's father, who was always affectionate with her, despite her far from angelic character. They were not rich, but they were not poor either. Augustus was engaged in cattle breeding, successfully multiplying his property from year to year, so that Selina never needed anything. Sometimes her husband even gave her jewelry made of expensive metals, which cost him a lot of work and effort, but Selina was rarely satisfied with them. They seemed to her not expensive enough. They lived this way for many years until 3 years ago Augustus died of a wool fever at the age of 57. Only then it turned out that Selina was not as indifferent to her husband as it sometimes seemed from the outside. She bitterly mourned him for a whole year and never fully recovered from the loss. The remnants of her beauty had completely withered, her character had completely deteriorated, and the source of interest for her now was only the family property, which after the death of his father passed into the hands of Herbert. By this time Herbert had turned into a handsome young man whose dark eyes were exciting the minds of many girls in the county. However, he was not greedy for women's attention. Selina could freely rely on her eldest son. Herbert confidently held the farm in his hands, and over the past 3 years he had significantly multiplied the wealth acquired by Augustus. Jack, of course, willingly helped him in this. As in childhood, so now they remained the closest friends, a reliable support which they never had to doubt. Jack, unlike Herbert, did not grow up to be handsome. Nevertheless, he was not ugly either. He was not as tall as Herbert was, but he had the right build, slender and at the same time strong. He looked like a young wolf, lean and swift. His face was not perfect, but it was quite attractive, although he did not think so. He was annoyed by his nose, broken in childhood and slightly turned to the right side, by his big mouth, which didn't spoil him at all, but on the contrary gave him a kind of childish charm, and most of all by his hair, brown and curly, which made him, as he was sure, look like a lamb. In fact, he had no resemblance to a lamb. Even though he was not as popular as Herbert was, he also got the attention of the girls because he looked like a kind of courageous forest spirit, in whose arms it would be very nice to be. However, Jack did not notice this, and to be honest, it did not bother him much. He knew that when the time came, he would be able to create a family that he would diligently provide for all his life until he died of old age or illness, like his father did. Everyone lived like that in Silver Cauldron, and it was the same in hundreds of neighboring lands. Jack never approved of his mother's position, her eternal dissatisfaction with the life she led, although he himself sometimes felt vague anxiety, cruel helplessness before the emptiness of the path he had to go through. Moreover, sometimes he was even overcome by a painful feeling of loss. It seemed to him that every second of his life he was losing something important, priceless, that could have been with him under some other, happier circumstances. Nevertheless, since there was no reason for this confidence, Jack always quickly dismissed it from himself, not wanting to give free rein to senseless mental torment. In fact, he did not have time for such nonsense. He was no less responsible for the household than Herbert was, and preferred to treat his duties conscientiously, although sometimes he had a feeling that all his efforts were nothing more than the movement of water in the wheels of a mill. It did not frighten him, and did not cause rejection to what he was doing. That was how everyone lived around him, after all, and he did not consider himself any more significant or superior to others. That memorable Sunday, which so stunned all the inhabitants of Silver Cauldron, and a little later the people of many neighboring counties, began in the most ordinary way. A quiet, clear morning greeted Jack on a mountain not far from the village, where he was guarding his father's herd in the company of 2 watchdogs. The night turned out to be calm. The morning was even calmer, so Jack was peacefully dozing in a sitting position on the hill, exhausted by the long night of continuous vigil. Nevertheless, he heard the footsteps of Linda, his mother's young maidservant, long before she got close enough to speak to him. By the haste and unevenness of her steps, he immediately realized that she had come here for a reason. She had been sent with something urgent and important. It did not bother Jack at all. Selina's whims had long been a familiar thing to Herbert and him, and they treated them accordingly. "Master Jack!" Without the slightest desire, Jack opened his eyes and raised them to the servant girl who had arrived. The next second he froze with a trembling heart. Linda's face was whiter than milk, and in general she looked like she had just encountered a ghost or a living dead person. Jack did not realize how he got to his feet and grabbed her by the shoulders. "Mother, is she all right?" Linda shook her head convulsively. "Yes, Mistress Estancia is all right. Herbert, it is not about him. What happened then? Why do you look like you have escaped from the other world?" "Dark carriage has arrived," muttered Linda, getting even paler. Jack unconsciously released her and made a few steps back. "What do you mean?" "Dark carriage in Silver Cauldron. It stopped next to our house." Jack had never had any problems with hearing, but now he was ready to doubt the reality of what he had just heard.